Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the Dwarves in Total War Warhammer 3 to talk about their army compositions for the sake of campaigns. Now in every single Dwarven campaign with the exception of Forgrim, you will start with tier 2 settlements. And thus, you can get tier 2 units very quickly. And even in Forgrim's campaign, you're not really that far removed from being able to get to tier 2. Now, what kind of units you should recruit, that is a different discussion. Now, when you still have tier 1 barracks, because just because you start at tier 2 doesn't mean you have a tier 2 starting barracks. But with regards to units, initially for the first few turns, you would be looking at recruiting either Dwarf Warriors or Miners with blasting charges. Personally, I do prefer going with Dwarf Warriors, the shielded version. They're just far better than the great weapon version. Sure, they don't have as much damage, but you look at the durability of these guys, their HP, their armor, their silver shields, their leadership, and crucially that 40 melee defense, and you get a very, very durable line holder. Though you may not necessarily need any Dwarf Warriors or Miners or Blasting Charges. The value proposition of Miners or Blasting Charges is not their melee capability. In fact, their melee capability is pretty bad. Even though they have a good amount of armor, but they do lack in melee attack, melee defense, and weapon strength. But what you're looking to use from these guys are those blasting charges themselves. They can do a decent amount of damage, and they're fairly cheap units. But what you're looking to get in a Dwarf campaign is a combination of Quarrelers, Iron Drakes, Thunderers, and Gyrocopters. Now, some will argue that you should go full-on Gyrocopters very quickly in the Dwarf campaign. I don't quite agree with that sentiment. The reason I don't quite agree with that sentiment is that even though Gyrocopters are a very good unit, flying unit, does a decent amount of damage, has a pretty solid amount of ammunition, and the game clearly is not designed around flying units, the problem with Gyrocopters is that you will need an engineer, at least one engineer, to be of a higher level in order to fully utilize them. So the missile strength, the ammunition, the speed. And that just takes time to level an engineer up. One engineer. Now, you will be able to get an engineer fairly quickly in every single Dwarf campaign, but it is just that consideration to make with regards to them. This brings me to the point of heroes and lords. So you do want the Dwarf barracks, or you should get it at any rate, and that means you will get the Thane. The only exception is really Malachi's campaign, but there you have Gotrek, which kind of has the same role, you know, the melee duelist, with training, crucially. So Engineer gives you campaign movement range, various missile benefits. The Thane, or Gotrek, gives you training. Later on, of course, the Thane does give you certain benefits that Gotrek doesn't have. So you would eventually want to get the Thane even in Malachi's situation to some extent, especially if you're going with flame weapons for the army. Now, Lord choice-wise, I'd recommend getting a Rune Lord to lead your second army. Like the first Lord you're recruiting, besides, of course, you're using your Legendary Lord, should be a Rune Lord. The reason is, Rune Lords are really good early on because you can get the Rune of Wrath and Ruin, and with the Rune of Wrath and Ruin, you have an ability that does AoE damage that has no winds of magic. So this is an ability that can win you sieges, or pretty much any battle, but sieges especially when you're on the offense, it can win you sieges if you're willing to wait long enough for, you know, the cooldown to go over and over and over again, assuming the battle time limit is unlimited. But even if it's not, it's still a very powerful ability. Now, moving back to units, you would probably want to get your hands on Iron Drakes and Thunderers. So you would get the engineering building, you would get the barracks, and the third building you'd probably get would be the Iron Drake Thunderer one. Now, what do you choose? What's your priority? Do you go for... Because with the tier 2 settlement, you will have one building slot to spend on a second building. Well, I'd probably say you start with the barracks. You would want to get the Thane, a couple of Quarrelers, then you might delete that, get the Thunderer Iron Drake building. But your first priority should get the Engineer building and the Gyrocopter building, and then later on, a bit later on, just in a couple of turns, get Iron Drakes and Thunderers. So, Iron Drake's really solid unit, good amount of capability in terms of like just doing a lot of damage over time. Really good in choke points, just phenomenal damage. But you don't want to go too many of them. Reduce leadership, your flamethrower. Thunderers, pretty solid gunpowder unit, though, yeah, Dwarves being short does end up hurting their own gunpowder units quite a bit. But still, pretty solid gunpowder unit, good amount of durability over here with them. Bronze shield, decent enough melee stats so they can actually hold their own, but it's really the damage dealing capability and, you know, spell resistance that Dwarves inherently have that makes them useful. And then as your filler unit, and that's how I would view it, a filler unit, not your mainline unit, you get Quarrelers. Quarrelers with gray weapons and regular Quarrelers. The difference between Quarrelers and Quarrelers with gray weapons are better in melee in terms of fighting other melee units or dealing more damage to them, whereas regular Quarrelers are better line holders, so they'll resist damage better, they have that bronze shield, they have more melee defense in comparison to Quarrelers with gray weapons. So the same kind of dynamic that exists for Dwarf Warriors does exist for Quarrelers. I'd say a combination of the two is generally pretty useful. Having some of that melee armor piercing is pretty useful, but this is the kind of Dwarf army I would use. Or you could just recruit a bunch of Gyrocopters and go without Quarrelers or Dwarf Warriors or anything like that. Keep in mind, it does have its issues, it does have its limitations, and generally speaking, in a campaign situation, I dislike, personally, going with a one-pony trick type army because you will have opponents that will be able to one-up you. I'm pretty sure that's why Legend of Total War gets a lot of the disaster battles that he does. But this is your very early game Dwarf army, something you can get in a couple of turns in pretty much every single Dwarf campaign. Forgrim might be a bit slower in getting this, but he will get it. Ungrim, you do have to delete the Slayer building, though I would recommend getting a couple of Slayers for him just to unlock Garagrim very quickly. But once you do have enough Slayers to be able to unlock Garagrim, yeah, you do want to ultimately start being able to recruit this kind of army for your secondary army, even as Ungrim. You don't just want to go full-on Slayer army, suffice to say. Or you could, if you want to, but not recommended. Moving on, between the early game and the mid game, once you get your provincial capital to tier 3, this is the kind of Dwarf army you should be looking to aim for. But let me explain something on this subject. The way you should handle your campaign is you should always build up your provincial capital first to tier 3. But you don't want your barracks or your Iron Drake Thunderer building in a major settlement, because they can be maxed out in a minor settlement, so there's no reason to waste those precious building slots in a provincial capital when you can get things like the Deeps, when you can get other buildings over there, including the engineer building, which is more important. There's no value in wasting that building slot for either a barracks or an Iron Drake Thunderer building. So you will get tier 3 barracks, so Longbeards, Iron Drakes with Trollhammer, Torpedoes, and Grudge Raker Thunderers later on in the campaign. I mean, you could rush them, but I personally don't necessarily see the incentive for it, especially when you can get more engineers, runesmiths, that kind of stuff. And this brings me to the runesmith. Once you get your provincial capital to tier 3, one of the things you should start getting there are runesmiths. Quite a few of them. They're like rune lords. They're really good in giving you that extra utility in battle through the spells that aren't spells, that just have a cooldown and no wins of magic cost. So yeah, you want a rune lord still to be leading an early game army, because this is still considered an early game army, and then have a runesmith to support that situation. Beyond that, you would be keeping some of the Quarrelers in an army, and by this point, you're looking at 3-4 armies, so recruiting a bunch of Quarrelers early on, and a bunch of Iron Drakes and Thunderers, and then shifting those to newer forces is a good strategy. And for your principal armies, your Legendary Lord army, your secondary army, you'd be looking at supplementing those beyond Gyrocopters, Thunderers, and Quarrelers. I would keep the Quarrelers with shields just for the line holding capability, along with Thunderers for line holding, to protect the Iron Drakes and, crucially, the cannons. The reason you want cannons, siege capability. I would not go full flying unless I'm playing and even in Grumbrindle, I don't necessarily like going full flying mode. until later on in a campaign. I'll talk about that in just a second. But point is, you do need the siege capability. Now, grudge throwers are not a worthless unit. They're a good artillery unit for what it is. It's a tier 2 unit. But cannons are just flat out better in most ways that matter, with the exception of defensive sieges. Like, I think grudge throwers are just better in defensive sieges because of the way their projectiles work. But yeah, dwarf cannons are pretty much the kind of unit you want. And besides, if you're playing a dwarf campaign and you ever get a provincial capital attack, you've screwed up by the numbers as far as I see it. There's very few situations where that would matter. So grudge throwers, it's not worth getting that artillery building, except if it's in a main settlement. So limited building slots, all that. Let's say you start with a minor settlement being 2, if you're looking at Belagar, if you're looking at Grombrindal, or even if you start at provincial capital being tier 2, this is the kind of priority. You might build some stuff initially in a provincial capital if you're looking at Ungrim, just to get access to some stuff very quickly, but then you'd shift those things to minor settlements. Yes, that does happen in campaigns. So cannons, very useful for sieges, and then to support the regular gyrocopters, I would get gyrocopters with brimstone guns. Now, let me talk a bit about brimstone guns. Regular gyrocopters are the more nimble unit, so they can fly around the battlefield doing damage faster on the fly. But gyrocopters with brimstone guns just do better damage over time. It's not even really... It's not really even that much of a contest when you're considering that. Like, just having a flying freaking flamethrower, and keep in mind the leadership penalty that you're inflicting with these things. Now, sure, if you're playing with maxed out AI stats, that may not necessarily matter. I would recommend not doing so, because it's a bloody pain in the ass to deal with it. But having a couple of gyrocopters and gyrocopters with brimstone guns, from my point of view, is generally the way you want to go for... It's still the early game. Like, again, this is still the early game. Just because you have one settlement at tier 3 does not mean you're in the mid game. The mid game is when you start getting multiple settlements and you max out an entire province at tier 3 with minor settlements as well. That's when you're starting to talk about the kind of mid game situation in a campaign. So yeah, just get Quarrelers, get Iron Drakes, get Thunderers early on, get Engineer, get Thane, and then get Cannons and Brimstone Guns to replace some of the units and give those units to another army, which in itself would also recruit Gyrocopters and Brimstone Guns. Like, you want to always be recruiting units, but you want to recruit units in such a way that, okay, I'm not going to replace these guys very easily. And that's the thing about Iron Drakes and Thunderers. They are relevant pretty much throughout the entire campaign. Quarrelers too, surprisingly. Like, before the Dwarf rework, the best Dwarf army to get in a campaign was a combination of Quarrelers, Iron Drakes, artillery. Really. It did work. Gyrocopters got changed substantially by CA with Thrones of Decay, and that's what made them exceptionally useful. Now, for the mid-game and the mid-game to late-game transition, so you're talking about Tier 4. Tier 5 is not worth talking about because by the time you get to Tier 5, you've pretty much won your campaign in most cases. But Tier 4 units are very relevant. One of the things you can recruit earlier on are actually hammers. But unless you're talking about Forgrim, I would just say hammers are usually not worth recruiting. The reason is, even though they have good melee capability and a good amount of armor, they don't necessarily complement your army playstyle. Like, you could make an entire melee dwarf army work if you wanted to, but you have so much range firepower that can win you battles without you even trying to win them. That's not, generally speaking, worth considering all that much with respect to that. But you can do it if you want to. One of the units that I would be looking to get in terms of melee capability are Iron Breakers. These are some of the best line holders in the game. They have a very high level of armor. And here's the thing to understand. When you have a couple of melee units in an army like this, those melee units will generally take a lot more damage from the auto-resolve. And yes, you do have... you may have a lot of battles that you want to auto-resolve in a campaign. So having an army that's good and effective is one thing. Having an army that's good, effective, and also handles auto-resolve pretty well is a completely different matter. And that's where Iron Breakers come in, because they're so incredibly heavily armored that they will take those hits far better than most other things. Now, you could still keep Iron Drakes and Thunders and all that, but what you can then get, once you have, like, every settlement at tier 3, and you're moving over to tier 4, you can get Thunderers with Grudge Rakers. They do a tremendous amount of damage, even if their range is more limited. And they're still just as good line holders as the regular Thunderers are. So having these guys to supplement an army is very useful. Then you have Iron Drakes with Trollhammer Torpedoes. They work differently. They're not so much damage over time, but they're rather like a shotgun unit when you're thinking about them. So they can do a good amount of damage with those Trollhammer Torpedoes. It's actually pretty damn crazy. Artillery-wise, you'd keep your cannons. You'd keep those cannons throughout the course of the campaign, but then you could also look to supplement them with some organ guns as well, because, like, yeah, more limited range, but a heck of a lot more damage in field battles in particular, especially against infantry when you're looking at those organ guns over there. But yeah, the more limited range is something that can hurt, but still very useful. The final unit to talk about is our gyro bombers. I think a lot of people just talk about thunder barges and gyrocopters, but really the winner of a unit, from my point of view, in terms of flying dwarf units, the unit that scales very well throughout the campaign and can make up the mainstay of your endgame armies if you're going with flying units, is the gyro bomber. See, gyro bombers have a lot of bombs, right? And they just do a lot of damage. Not as much as a Trollhammer Torpedo gyrocopter, to be sure, but that's just because Trollhammer Torpedoes are freaking ridiculous. Like, it's basically this unit flying. But if we look at gyro bombers and we start shooting at the enemy, every single shot that they do is going to do a decent amount of damage. And because they have so many bombs, well, get a couple of these flying overhead of the enemy army, and you suddenly start looking at a situation where they're just going to do a terrific amount of damage. Boom, boom, boom. Though you may want to wait a bit with the bombs with respect to that when you're dumping them. Also, you may want to hold down the Alt key to position your units in a different way. So yeah, these things wreck formations. Though you might want to delay dropping bombs. Like, you don't necessarily want to drop your bombs all at once, because a single bomb throw will already disrupt an enemy formation, so you just kind of want to spread the love around on different kinds of units. And keep in mind, when you're thinking about gyrocopters and gyro bombers, inherently as units, they might not seem so extraordinary, but it's really the combination of skills and engineers that really make these things deadly in any campaign. And you might even be looking to have multiple dwarf engineers in an army, not just going with one, but 2 or even 3 engineers in dwarf campaign, and even drop the Thane completely from an army. I would still keep the Runesmith. I would keep Dwarf. I would also at this point start getting regular Dwarf Lords to lead the army, because you will have enough Runesmiths to fill up every army, so you don't necessarily need the Rune Lords anymore. And the Dwarf Lord is just a better melee combatant and the better army leader in quite a few ways. Just keep those kind of aspects in mind when you're thinking about, like, oh, how am I going to recruit a tier 3, tier 4 army? Well, this is what you're looking at. So early tier 4 kind of army situation right here in a campaign, just like the kind of units that you'd be aiming for to get at tier 4. The other units, the ones you've already recruited, well, yeah, those would be different armies, weaker armies, spread the love around. You'd obviously want to use regiments right now and all that. Realistically, I'll be honest, an army like this is kind of a luxury that by the time you can get it, your campaign as a dwarf is probably already nearing its end, and it might just be worth to recruit cheaper units with lower upkeep that can still get the job done. But if you just want a huge amount of combat power, something like this, minus the hammers, would be worth it, like, as an option. But let's talk about endgame dwarf armies, just purely endgame dwarf armies, what you'd be looking at over there. So for endgame dwarf options, you have either the ability of going with pure flying stack, or the ability of going with a ground-based army with some flying units to provide you greater flexibility. Also, just having the ability of skirmishing with the enemy unit, with enemy units from the sky, especially being able to draw them into your prepared positions. Gyrocopters are the best option from that specific perspective. Of course, dwarves do have Age of Reckoning, and you will be getting some units from Age of Reckoning that are absolutely worth recruiting. So, be it Quarrelers from the Age of Reckoning, which are fairly easy to acquire, that do have Shield Breaker, which reduces enemy missile block chance. So, pretty useful to have one of these in every single army, and you will have quite a few of those. Then you do have Iron Drakes, Grudge Seller Iron Drakes, greater range. Also, you know, flammable, weakness to fire damage. And then hammers from Grudge Sellers, which are much better than the regular hammers because they have freaking Frenzy. It might seem like a small difference, but it is actually a pretty damn substantial difference in terms of how useful these guys end up being. Besides that, in terms of the units, you would have cannons, you would have organ guns, you would want to maybe get Grudge Rakers, or you could just go with regular Quarrelers or Rangers, even if you want to. Though I find Rangers, their lack of durability to hurt them quite a bit. Hero-wise, yeah, Thanes, Engineers, maybe multiple Engineers, especially if you don't have Grudge Sellers or you don't want to go with them. But I would not sacrifice on some of the flying capability. Even a single Gyro Bomber or single Gyrocopter is a significant benefit to any dwarf army. Dragon Slayers, when you're looking at them as a hero option, so when you're looking at Dragon Slayers, they're not really a great hero in combat. They do require you to invest in items and in skills, so you need to get them to a higher level for them to really prove their worth in terms of battle, but they are your replenishment hero, and you will want them. Though getting a lot of these in a campaign until tier 4 is a problem, unless you're playing Ungrim or Malachi, in which case really it's just more so the fact that you have an easier time getting Garagrim, and as Malachi and Ungrim, you just basically either start a campaign with the ability of getting one of these guys, or you will get one of these guys very quickly, or multiple of these guys very quickly in Malachi's campaign situation. But this is a kind of ground-based dwarf army. Now, in terms of allied recruitment, what you really want from your allies is Cav. So for the Empire, you have two good choices. You have Demigryph Knights as a tier 4 unit, if your Empire allies do get over there to tier 4, or you have Knights of the Blazing Sun as an earlier unit. I would not spend any of the allied recruitment points on anything else besides Knights of the Blazing Sun or Demigryph Knights. You could talk about steam tanks or hellstorms to be sure to complement your artillery if you want to, but just having fast-moving units to chase down the enemy, finish them off, is generally speaking going to be a benefit. You might recruit Ogre Mercenaries, Man-Eaters with Ogre Pistols in particular are very useful. But yeah, in general, what you want from your allies, regardless of who you ally, fast-moving units, cavalry to chase down an enemy. The more durable, the better. Knights of the Blazing Sun are really good in this role because they have a huge charge bonus, pretty solid speed. Demigryph Knights with Halberds are more of a stand and fight type cav. I would generally get Demigryph Knights with Halberds as opposed to regular one, even if they'd lose on the shock cav version and shock capability, less charge bonus. But they do have armor piercing, they do have a bonus versus large. So both of these kind of units are very useful to get in terms of allied recruitment. So this is one option. Keep in mind, you might have more heroes that you want to put in an army. You might have more Grudge Sellers, you have Regiments Renown, all that kind of stuff. So just consider this is, the kind of army you get. Like, you could just forego going with Iron Breakers, for instance. Yeah, you would probably want Iron Breakers. You could forego Iron Breakers and just get more Thanes, for instance, or more Runesmiths, or more Engineers in an army like this. Just worth mentioning that aspect about an army of this nature. But that's one option of a late-game dwarf army. Let's take a look at the flying option. So as far as a flying army for the dwarves in the late game will look like, it would be something like this. You could even forgo the runesmith, but Thanes aren't needed, Dragon Slayers aren't needed unless you really, really care about that kind of casualty replenishment. But yes, multiple engineers, because their benefits do stack and they're very substantial. You might even get items that give them stock, so you can keep them hidden in a battle and just kill the enemy with impunity. And then a combination of, let's say, a couple of gyrocopters with brimstone guns, because flamethrowers are still damn useful in a campaign, though you could just forgo them completely. Some Trollhammer torpedo gyrocopters, as many of them as you can get. Like, this is the ultimate screw you army, I want you to die kind of army. This is the kind of army you throw against an endgame crisis and annihilates it, because Trollhammer torpedoes, gyrocopters, are just like freaking ridiculous as units, especially with that many engineers. Like, it might not seem so much over here, but when I say engineers are significant for for flying armies or ranged armies of dwarves, it is absolutely true. In fact, I think like the main difference for Thrones of Decay wasn't so much the changes they made for gyrocopters, it's the fact that we can get a lot more engineers than we previously could in a campaign. Because anyone who's played the campaign as dwarves and actually invested in those scan lines and gotten those engineers knows exactly what Trollhammer torpedo grudge seller units do. It's more so the skirmish that just a bit lackluster, I'm not gonna lie. Maybe also some nerfs from CA because they were a bit ridiculous, but still, skirmish is not campaign. So what you're seeing here is obviously in skirmish, not the same situation whatsoever. And yeah, the mainline unit that you'd be relying on would be gyro bombers, because gyro bombers just high damage, reduces enemy speed, so, you know, a good amount of these just firing at the enemy will be pretty damn damaging, I'm not gonna lie on that subject. Even if it's not necessarily represented accurately at all. Like, yeah, there is a massive freaking difference between campaign and skirmish in quite a few ways. But you might ask, well, what about the Thunder Barges? What about them? Never recruit them. I've played hundreds of hours in Dwarven campaigns ever since Thrones Decay. In every single patch, I've played Dwarven campaigns at every single major patch, and I can tell you, Thunder Barges, I've never recruited a single one of them, except the free ones in Malachi's campaign. And the reason is, why invest so much money into a single unit, a slow-ass unit, when you can get a faster-moving unit, or a flying flamethrower, or something that literally kills legendary lords with ease in battles in a campaign? The benefits they get with dwarf engineers make gyrocopters and gyrobombers so bloody substantial that they far outmatch in terms of cost value, right? Ease of recruitment, cost value, and by the time you get to tier 4, tier 5, it's over. Like, even tier 5 is already pushing it in a dwarf campaign, so even getting a bunch of gyro bombers is already really, really pushing. And getting a single Thunder Barge recruited is a luxury. Like, you can get it if you want it, but I just don't think that I don't think Thunder Barge stacks are worth it. Like, you can get 1 or 2 of them if you really want to, but I would not recruit an entire stack of Thunder Barge. I just think that's a waste of money. And that's, by the way, my comment in response to all the people who complained ever since TOD, like, oh, it's just a power creep, Thunder Barge is too powerful. You want to look the dwarf power creep? It's engineers and gyro bombers, because they're far more cost effective. Hell, even regular gyrocopters or brimstone guns I'd say are generally worth recruiting more, because of the buffs that engineers give them. It just shows you that why it's so important to have hero recruitment widely available, because it's not just the individual combat capability that a hero provides you, it's also the kind of buffs that they provide you both in campaign and in battle to your armies, right? Or to your empire. This is something that hurts a lot of different races, and yeah, when you can get a lot of different freaking engineers, I'd say free is probably the good middle ground. You can go more if you want to. You can go with a lot more if you want to, but yeah, just kind of that middle ground. That's my perspective. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And yes, this kind of army doesn't need allied recruitment, unless you get lucky enough to get good relations with Bretonia, and then you might get melee cav, flying cav from them, like Hippogriff Knights. But yeah, that's tricky, I would say, with respect to Bretonia. But yeah, this kind of army does not need allied recruitment. Maybe a steam tank from the Empire, maybe. You know, just an idea. Get the steam tank. Just a notion on that subject. But anyway, that's all I had to say. Christine signing out.